Welcome to the Ionic Basics course. In this course, we will introduce you to the Ionic framework. The Ionic framework is one of the most popular front-end web development frameworks for building amazing cross-platform mobile applications for Android, iOS, and even Windows. Before we start with our journey of learning to build mobile apps using the Ionic framework, let's have a look at what this course consists of. In this section, we will start by installing all the tools and packages required to get started with the development of mobile apps using the Ionic framework. We will also set up a new Ionic app from scratch and also learn how to run the app within a web browser and an Android emulator. Next, we will learn the basics of Ionic. We will learn how an Ionic app works. We will get introduced to the Ionic CLI and how it helps us to build apps faster without worrying about a lot of the concerns. We will conclude this section by learning the role of Angular and Apache Cordova in building an Ionic app. This section is one of the two most interesting and fun sections where we will learn how to use Ionic components to build the user interface in our apps. We will learn to use buttons, icons, inputs, checkboxes, lists, cards, and grids to build beautiful native interfaces. In the next section, we will shift into a higher gear and learn further about more complex components that are shipped with Ionic. We will learn how we can build basic interactions with these components. We will learn how to display alerts, pop-ups, prompts, confirmations, and much more. We will also learn about navigation between pages in Ionic. In this section, we will learn how to use the Ionic and Angular concepts to communicate with a REST API in our Ionic application. We will use the built-in HTTP modules to send requests to a remote web service. We will be building a very basic weather application in this section. Finally, in this very last section, we will be building our app that we created in a previous section for Android and make this ready to be published in the Google Play Store. Finally, we will learn how to publish the app to the Play Store so that millions of users can use the app we built. To get started with this course, you do not need to learn any technology or programming language in advance. However, basic knowledge of HTML, CSS, and JavaScript will come in handy to understand the basic syntaxes that we're going to use throughout the course. We're going to use TypeScript because Ionic uses Angular, which has built-in support for TypeScript. You do not need to know TypeScript. You'll get introduced to TypeScript along the way, but if you have worked with TypeScript before, that is definitely an added advantage. Since we're going to work on a mobile application that will work on real mobile devices, it is beneficial to understand how mobile devices work. If you are watching this course, then you probably already know what mobile apps are, and you're probably going to already be curious how to learn how to develop an app. Finally, all you need is a computer that is connected to the internet. We will be installing everything off the internet in the starting lectures, and therefore, it is important that you are connected to the internet at all times. If you are willing to learn, you will learn. If you feel lost at any point in the course, feel free to post a question in the Q&A section. Do not give up. Sometimes it looks harder than it actually is. Everything sounds so much fun, right? So, let's get started. Hello, and welcome to the first major section in the Ionic Basics course. In this section, we will start our journey slowly, and then get ready for the ride ahead. We will set up our system by installing the required tools and packages on our computer so we can get started with developing an Ionic app. Next, we will create our very first Ionic app using just a few commands. Then, we will inspect the contents of the app that we created and look at the important files and folders in the application project folder. Finally, we will learn how to run an Ionic app in the web browser and also in an Android emulator. Are you ready? Let's get started. Hello. In this lecture, we will get started with the installation of the minimum required tools and packages we need to create our very first Ionic application. We will start by installing Node.js, which is the most basic requirement of developing Ionic apps. So, head over to nodejs.org and download the version of Node.js for your operating system and architecture. I am here on Windows 10 64-bit, so I will download the version accordingly. Once downloaded, install Node.js.
Oh my fucking god. I should have taken a break first, because my mind is just like all over the place right now. And I lose access tomorrow, so I gotta fucking speed this shit up. Okay, I'll just do without doing it, I guess. I'll just do it without doing it. Nah, fuck it. Let's do this.
It is a fairly simple and straightforward process. Next, we need a text editor, and we will be using the very popular Visual Studio Code. So head over to code.visualstudio.com and download the installer for your operating system. VS Code is available for Mac, Linux, and Windows. Download and install VS Code as we will be using it for the rest of this course. You can use any editor, but VS Code is the one I recommend. Once everything is installed, before proceeding, we will test if everything is installed properly and is working fine or not. So open a command prompt or a terminal if you're on a Mac and type in node space -v. This command will give you the version number of Node.js installed on your machine. If all goes well, you should see a version number just like this. Next, along with Node.js is installed npm, the Node Package Manager. So let's check if it's installed properly or not. Type in npm-v, and this should give you the version of npm installed just like this. Now, we are ready to install the Ionic CLI and Cordova. Both Ionic and Cordova can be installed using npm. So go ahead and type in npm space install space Ionic space -g, where -g makes sure Ionic is installed globally on your machine. Similarly, install Cordova just by replacing Ionic with Cordova in this command. Once finished, check if Ionic and Cordova are installed properly or not. Simply type in Ionic space -v, and this will, as usual, give you the version of Ionic installed. I have version 3.9.2 installed, which is the latest version at the time of the recording of this lecture. Similarly, the version of Cordova installed is 6.5.0. Now that everything we need is installed, we are ready to create our very first Ionic app using the Ionic CLI. In this lecture, we will create our very first Ionic app using the Ionic CLI. As you can see, I have the Ionic CLI installed, just as we did in the last lecture. To create the new Ionic app, we need to type in Ionic space start space hello world space blank. Let's break down the command into its parts and understand what each piece means. Ionic signifies we are going to use the Ionic CLI. Start tells the CLI we want to create or start a new Ionic project. Hello World is the name of our project. This is actually different from the name of the app created. And finally, blank, the name of the template that we're going to use to create this project. There are a total of 3 templates that Ionic offers: blank, tabs, and side menu. For now, we will just use the blank template, which will create a completely blank Ionic project for us. Go ahead and press enter. The CLI will start downloading some files and create a new folder for our project. As you can see, the new folder with the project named Hello World has been created. Let's wait for this process to complete. Please note, this might take some time as this involves a lot of network operations, and the time taken depends upon the speed of your connection. Once this is done, you can open the project in VS Code. To do that, change the current directory to the project directory and just type in code space period, and the project folder will open in VS Code. You can see all the files and folders of the project here on the left. Alternatively, you can also right-click on the project folder and select Open with Code from the menu, and the project will open in VS Code. In this lecture, we will have a look at the folders and files that the Ionic CLI created for us in the last lecture. Here, we have our project open in VS Code, and on the left, we have the whole directory structure available to us. The first folder that we want to take a look at is the SRC folder. This is the folder that contains all the source code of our Ionic app, and this is the place where we will be working most of the time while building an Ionic app. Inside the SRC folder, we have a number of folders and files. The app folder contains the entry points for our app, and these files load up important components and modules to make an Ionic app work. We are not going to go into the details for now, but the nitty-gritty of the app folder is that the files here specify some of the most important configuration of our Ionic app. Next, we have the assets folder, which is used to put in the static assets for our app like images, fonts, etc. Then we have the pages folder. That contains one folder for each page in our application. As you can see, we have a folder called Home, which contains the HTML, SCSS, and TS files that together create a page for our app. As we create new pages in the app, we will be creating new folders here. Lastly, the theme folder contains a file called variables.scss, which basically specifies the styling or colors of our Ionic app. Then, inside the SRC folder, we have an index.html file that is loaded first, just like a web app. Some other files here are only useful when we deploy our Ionic app as a progressive web app. In the www folder lives the code that is generated when we compile an Ionic app. The code in the SRC folder is transpiled to the generated code in the www folder, which can also be deployed as a web app. This code is used while packaging our app using Cordova. We will learn more about this in later lectures. Generally, I don't care what's inside the www folder, we only care about the code in the SRC folder. Another important file we have here is config.xml, which contains important information about the app. It contains information like package name, app name, description, and a lot of other vital information. Then we have an ionic.config.json file that contains information about your Ionic app when you connect it to the Ionic cloud. We're not going to worry about that for now. Finally, like any other Node.js project, we have a package.json file that specifies the dependencies that the project depends on. This file is responsible for creating the node_modules folder, which contains all the modules that we need to make the Ionic app work. The resources folder contains the icon and splash screen images for the app. I understand this is too much information at once. For now, just remember that all we care about is the SRC folder because that is where we will be working for the rest of the course. Welcome. In this lecture, we will learn how to run our Ionic app in a web browser such as Google Chrome. We will also learn about different ways to run the app in a browser. Start off by opening the integrated terminal in VS Code from the View menu, or press Ctrl backtick. To run the Ionic app, all you have to do is type in Ionic space serve, and this command will transpile the TypeScript code in the SRC folder to the corresponding JavaScript code in the www folder, and it will also launch a local web server. It will then launch the app in a web browser. This might take a little while depending on how big your app is. As you can see, the app is now launched in a web browser on the right. Although it doesn't look like a mobile app, you can change the viewport to emulate a mobile device. Head over to the Chrome options, select More Tools, then select Developer Tools. This opens the Chrome Developer Tools window. This window will be used a lot to debug apps throughout this course. Click on the Toggle Device toolbar icon, and then you can select any device of your choice to emulate the screen of that device. For now, let's just choose Google Nexus 6P. You can see that our Ionic app now looks like a mobile app in the browser. If you make even a small change to the code in VS Code, the changes will be immediately reflected in the browser. Let's try that. Open the home.html file in SRC Pages Home, and just change the title text to something like Hello World and save the file. Press Ctrl S. As soon as you save the file, the app code is transpiled again, and the app is reloaded in the browser to reflect the changes. This is how you debug apps in Ionic using the browser and the Chrome developer tools. And just change the title text to something like Hello World and save the file. Press Ctrl S. As soon as you save the file, the app code is transpiled again, and the app is reloaded in the browser to reflect the changes. This is how you debug apps in Ionic using the browser and the browser text to something like Hello World and save the file. Press Ctrl S. As soon as you save the file, the app code is transpiled again, and the app is reloaded in the browser to reflect the changes. This is how you debug apps in Ionic using the browser and the Chrome developer tools. There is one more way to test how your apps will look in different platforms, including Android, iOS, and Windows. Stop the server by pressing Ctrl-C, and then Yes or Y. You can now close the Chrome tab as well. Along with the Ionic serve command, you can pass in a flag called -L or --lab. This will launch our app in lab mode. Let's see what that looks like. In lab mode, the UI looks a lot better. The app looks exactly like how it would like in an Android device. You can even turn on or off the platforms you want to test on. Let's select all 3 platforms for now. This shows how our app is going to look on Android, iOS, and Windows respectively, from left to right. You can see that the styling is a little different on each platform. For example, the title on iOS is center-aligned, while on Android and Windows it is left-aligned. This styling is applied to make the app look exactly as it would like on a real device, and to provide a near-native experience to users. Let's try to change the color of the top bar in VS Code. All we have to do is add an attribute called color to the ion-navbar tag, and pass in the value primary. Save the file and see how the app refreshes in the browser for all 3 platforms. You can choose to debug your apps with or without lab mode, but we will be using Ionic Serve a lot in upcoming lectures. In the last lecture, we ran our app in the browser, but sometimes we need to run our app in an emulator or a real device to test certain features that cannot be tested in the browser. Running the app in an emulator also gives us an idea of how the app will perform on real devices, where we have many constraints. So, now we will run the app in an emulator. To run the app on an emulator or a real Android device, you need to type in Ionic Cordova run Android, where Android is the name of the platform. You can replace it with other platform names like iOS or Windows to test on those platforms. If you want to test on a real phone, make sure that the USB debugging is enabled on your phone and the phone is connected to your PC via a USB cable. Go ahead and press enter. The Android platform will be added to the project, and you will see a newly created folder in the project folder called Platforms. Inside this folder will reside the individual projects for each platform. Let's wait until the app is transpiled and built. Once the app is built, an Android emulator will be launched and the app will be deployed to the emulator. You can see the emulator starting and the Android OS booting up on it. And the app is successfully deployed to the emulator. The app looks exactly the same as it was looking in the browser, but this is a more real-world scenario. You can also use the --live reload flag to see changes made reflected in the app on the emulator in almost real time. Let's try that. We will run the same command again, but this time we will pass along the --live reload flag. Let's wait for the app to launch again. Let's make a small change to the app's code again. So I will change the color from primary to danger, which is another predefined color in Ionic. As soon as we save the file, the app will reflect the changes in the emulator. The color of the navigation bar on the top changed to a nice red color. We can change the text also, and the changes are almost immediately reflected. This is another way of working on your app while in development to quickly review your design while you write the markup. We can use the Chrome developer tools with the Android emulator as well. So let's open up a Chrome window here and open the developer tools from the Chrome options menu. Then select Options, More Tools, and Remote Devices. There you will see a list of all the connected devices. Select the one that your app is working on and click on Inspect. Connected Device Remote Options menu. Then select Options, More Tools, and Remote Devices. There you will see a list of all the connected devices. Select the one that your app is working on and click on Inspect. This will open a console window that will display the logs from your app so you can spot any errors, if any, which is otherwise very difficult when your app is running on a device or emulator. Let's write a console log statement in the constructor of our home.ts file, and let's save the file. As the app reloads in the emulator, you will see the newly added console log in the console window that we just opened. You can also see a few errors related to CSS fonts that we can safely ignore for now. This is how we debug an Ionic app when running in an emulator or a real Android device. In this section, we will look back on what we did in the previous section and try to understand how an Ionic app actually works. We will understand how it all happens behind the scenes, and thus, we will understand the whole process in detail. Finally, we will learn about Angular and Cordova. These two words sound a little scary, but we're going to break it all down for you. Are you ready? Let's go. In this lecture, we will learn how an Ionic app works. We will have a look into the core files that make an Ionic app work. So these files are inside the src/app folder. Let's have a look at these files. As you can see, we have an app.component.ts file, an app.html file, an app.module.ts file, an app.scss file, and a main.ts file. Let's understand how all this works together. In step 1, the TS file is loaded and it tells Angular which Angular module to be loaded first. And here, we are specifying that the first Angular module to be loaded is app module, which is defined inside the app.module.ts file. In step 2, the root or first Angular module is loaded and it defines the components pages directly.
Leagues above. Leagues above. I'm gonna take a long ass break. No, actually, I'm just gonna take 5 minutes. 5 minutes of some YouTube and then back to the grind. break time over. That was like a good 20-minute little break, but I gotta finish this Ionic course by today. Okay.
In this lecture, we will learn how an Ionic app works. We will have a look into the core files that make an Ionic app.component mod a main. In step 1, to be loaded first. And here, we are specifying that the first Angular module to be loaded is app module, which is defined inside the app.module.ts file. In step 2, the root or first Angular module is loaded, and it defines the components, pages, directives, services, providers, etc. that we'll be using in our Ionic app. A simple Ionic app can be comprised of just one Angular module. But as the app becomes larger and more complex, it can be broken down into multiple modules. In step 3, the root component is loaded, which is defined inside the app.component.ts file. A component file is often accompanied by a corresponding HTML and SCSS file that defines its view. Hence, we have an app.html and an app.scss file. Have HTML app module, which is defined inside the app.module.ts file. In step 2, the root or first Angular module is loaded, and it defines the components, pages, directives, services, providers, etc. that we'll be using in our Ionic app. A simple Ionic app can be comprised of just one Angular module, but as the app becomes larger and more complex, it can the root or first Angular module is loaded, and it defines the components, pages, directives, services, providers, etc. that we'll be using in our Ionic app. A simple Ionic app can be comprised of just one Angular module, but as the app becomes larger and more complex, it can be broken down into multiple modules. In step 3, the root component is loaded, which is defined inside the app.component.ts file. A component file is often accompanied by a corresponding HTML and SCSS file that defines its view. Hence, we have an app.html and an app.scss file. In the last step, the app component acts as a placeholder for other component pages and directives. Now, let's have a look at each of the files in VS Code, pages and directives. The app component acts as a placeholder for other component pages and directives. Now, let's have a look at each of the files in VS Code. Starting with the main.ts file, it contains nothing for the CSS file. In the last step, the app component acts as a placeholder for other component pages and directives. Now, let's have a look at each of the files in VS Code. Starting with the main.ts file, it contains nothing but the code to import and bootstrap the only Angular module in our app module. In the app.module.ts, we have the definition of the app module. You can see that at the bottom, we are exporting the app module class, which in turn is imported in the main.ts file. In the app module, we define a number of specifications about the module. We define the names of all the pages, components, directives, providers, etc. that we'll be using in the app. So whenever we create new pages, components, directives, you get the point, we will have to come back to this file and add the respective entries here. We are not going to deep dive into this for now. Next, let's move to the app.component.ts file, which has a template attached to it, app.html. The role of the app component is just to act as a placeholder for our pages and components. We are setting a root page, which specifies which page will be loaded first when the app loads. Here, the value of root page is set to home page, which represents our only page in the app. We have it imported from the /pages/home/home folder. The app.html file defines the view of our component and contains nothing but a placeholder that will display our root page. Finally, the home page, just like the app component, is accompanied by an HTML and SCSS file as well. The TS file specifies the template file, which is the home.html file in the same folder. The HTML file contains all the HTML that is displayed when the app loads. The SCSS file contains the styling for the homepage. So, on a high level, this is basically how an Ionic app works. In this lecture, we are going to understand in a little more detail the role of Angular and Cordova in an Ionic app. The Ionic framework is a front-end framework that helps us build mobile apps, right? Well, not exactly. Most of the work that Ionic does is similar to what Bootstrap does for web apps. It provides styling to the apps so the apps can look native on each platform, Android, iOS, and Windows. Angular, on the other hand, is another front-end framework that helps us build scalable web applications using TypeScript. So all these features like modules, components, pages, directives, providers, etc. are all inherited in Ionic because Ionic uses Angular. Angular uses all these concepts to make apps fast, scalable, and modular. The code is also well organized in files and folders, so if you change something, other parts of the app are less impacted. Each page in an Ionic app is an Angular component that can be reused when required. Components are basic building blocks of an Angular app, and hence pages of an Ionic app. Angular uses TypeScript instead of traditional JavaScript. TypeScript is a superset of JavaScript. Once you write the code in TypeScript, no browsers can understand the code, at least not now. So the code is transpiled into the corresponding JavaScript code that the browsers can understand. Using TypeScript has a lot of benefits, the biggest one being that we can use the concepts of types and the IntelliSense in IDEs and text editors like Visual Studio Code. This saves a lot of time debugging apps for errors because most of the errors are spotted during coding. Once you have a web app ready with everything ready to be deployed, you can use Cordova to wrap that web app into a native mobile app for Android, iOS, and Windows. So we always write the code once using HTML, TypeScript, and SCSS, and then we generate apps for up to 3 platforms. Since these apps are not native mobile apps, but web apps that look like a mobile app and run in a browser, these apps do not have access to the device features like camera, GPS, fingerprint sensors, and other such features. For these functionalities, Cordova has a huge library of plugins that help Cordova, and thus Ionic apps, interact with the native device's hardware. In the next few modules, we will learn about the components that come with Ionic out of the box, and we will learn about building the UI of an Ionic app.
Welcome to the Ionic UI Components Basics section. In this section, you will learn the basics of using Ionic's simplest UI components to build amazing user interfaces for your mobile apps. Ionic ships with a lot of user interface components that we can use. We will start by learning how to use buttons, floating action buttons, or FABs, and using icons to add a visual clue. Then we will learn how to use inputs, checkboxes, and radio buttons. These are required when you need to take input from the user in a form. We will also learn how to create select options in Ionic. We will also learn how to build lists in Ionic. These lists can be customized to offer amazing sliding functionality to reveal more buttons. This kind of user interface is used in apps like Gmail. Finally, we will learn about using cards and grids in Ionic. Welcome. From this lecture onward, we are going to learn about how to build the UI of a mobile app using the Ionic framework. We will be using the same Hello World application for now. Open the same project in VS Code and follow along. Here, I have the project Hello World open in VS Code. I will quickly head over to the only page in my app called Home. Let's expand the src folder, then Pages folder, and then the Home folder. In here, I have 3 files, but we will be writing the code for the UI in the home.html file. Let's open that file. Here, I have a project Hello World. I will get rid of this pre-filled code between the ion-content tags. All the page content is placed inside the ion-content tags. This is where we will be working. You can see the Ionic dev server running at the bottom that you can run using the command ionic serve, which makes sure that you can make changes to the code on the left, and the changes are immediately reflected in the browser on the right. As soon as I remove the dummy code, the app preview on the right is updated as well. Let's just update the title of the page to something relevant, like buttons, as we will be working on the buttons for this lecture. Time to create our first button. To create a button, we use the regular button tag in HTML. And along with that, we use a keyword right there in the tag as an attribute called ion-button. This is called a directive, as it adds additional functionality to the HTML button. We add the text button here in between the opening and closing tags. Let's see how the button looks like. This is how a basic button in Ionic looks like. Let's have a look at some other directives that we can add to the button tag to change its look. We can add a directive called block, which makes sure the button occupies the full width of the app page. Let's see how that looks. We can also use the outline directive, which removes the color fill from the button and just displays the outline of the button. Adding the clear directive removes the border of the button and just displays the text on the button. This is useful when you want the functionality of a button but don't want to display the button as a button. We can also combine these directives together to achieve the look we want. If we use the block and outline together, we will get the full width button that takes up the whole width of the page, and so the possibilities are endless. You can also add a directive called round that creates a button with rounded corners. You can use round along with other directives like outline, for example, and the result will look something like this. Lastly, we have a directive called full that makes sure the button is full width. The block and full are almost the same, except that the block button has well-defined corners, while the full button is like a horizontal strip from left to right. Along with these regular buttons, we can also create floating action buttons, which are widely used in modern Android apps, including Facebook. I'll simply refer to them as fabs throughout this lecture. To create a fab, you need to use a tag called ion-fab. Within the tags, you define a button just like we have been doing throughout this lecture. But instead of using the ion-button directive, we use ion-fab to make it look like a fab. Fabs don't go along with text, so we will need to remove this text and instead add an icon here. To add an icon, we will use the ion-icon tag. We will learn about icons in the next lecture. For now, we will just use an icon with the name set equal to add. This shows up as an add icon in the fab, just as we wanted. We can also change the position of the fab by specifying the horizontal and vertical position with the help of directives on the ion-fab tag. The default setting is such that the fab is always displayed on the left top corner. We can use right to move it to the right side. You can also use bottom to move it to the bottom of the screen. With both of these directives applied, it will now be displayed on the bottom right corner of the screen. You can also use middle, top, and bottom for vertical positioning, and left, center, right for horizontal positioning. With those, you can also use the directive called edge, which moves it towards the edge of the screen, like so. Edge is generally used with top right or top middle position. We can also create an ion-fab-list that displays a number of buttons when tapped on. So let's see how to create that. First, you need to create a regular fab button with the ion-fab tag and the button inside it. Let's also specify an icon on the button such that it looks like this button is meant to share something. Then, we will use a component called ion-fab-list inside so we can create as many fabs as we want. In here, I'm going to create 3 fabs, each with a different icon, and these fabs will not display just yet. We will have to tap on the main fab to display the list of fabs. Now, as long as I tap on the fab, the icon on the fab changes to a close icon, which indicates the fab is displaying the fab list, but since the list is opening vertically towards the bottom, it has exceeded the bottom margin of the page, and thus is not visible. So, we need to specify how to expand it in the upward direction instead of downward. On the ion-fab-list, we specify a directive or attribute called side with the value top. This makes sure that the fab list is expanding in the upward direction. See, now the fab list shows the up icon buttons. If you do not want the list to see, let's copy the fab, the icon on the fab changes to a close icon, which indicates the fab is displaying the fab list, but since the list is opening vertically towards the bottom, it has exceeded the bottom margin of the page, and thus is not visible. So, we need to specify how to expand it in the upward direction instead of downward. On the ion-fab-list, we specify a directive or attribute called side with the value top. This makes sure
that the fab list is expanding in the upward direction. See, now the fab list shows the up icon buttons. If you do not want the list to expand in the upward direction, you can always change the position of the fab button itself, and then change the expand direction accordingly. This is how we create buttons in Ionic. We still need to learn how to make these buttons do things, but we will do that in a later lecture. In this lecture, we will learn about how to use icons, change colors of buttons and fabs, and also their sizes. Before we proceed, let's clean up a bit. Let's learn about how to use icons within buttons first. All you need to do is use the button tag as usual, and within these button tags, let's go ahead and type some text here. Now, considering that I want the icon on the left of this text on the button, I want to use the ion-icon component before the text inside the button element. Ion-icon requires you pass in the name of the icon you want to display. To find out the correct name of the icon from a list of available icons, head over to ionicframework.com/docs/ionicons and search for the keyword. The keyword can be anything depending on what icon you're looking for. Let's search for the game keyword and see what we get in the results. As you can see, we get a list of 5 icons which are related to the keyword game. Let's select the second one, game-controller-B icon. Just click on it and select the name of the icon from the pop-up that opens. We can now use this name to display the icon in our app. Now, let's come back to VS Code and paste in the name-controller- B icon. Just click on it and select the name of the icon from the pop-up that opens. We can now use this name to display the icon in our app. Now, let's come back to VS Code and paste in that name that we just copied. You will now see the icon within the button to the left of the text. But this does not look very nice. All we need to do is add a directive to the button tag, icon-left, or icon-right, depending on where your icon actually is in the button. I will use icon-left. And as I save, you can see the icon now looks a lot better than before. It is properly aligned with the text. Even if you change the button type, the icon will adjust itself accordingly. Now, let's look at how to change the size of the buttons. All we need to use are directives called small and large. By default, the button size is medium, so we do not have a directive for that. Let's see how the small button looks. Now, let's change the size of the third button to large and see how it looks. You can see the sizes of all 3 buttons vary. You can also change the size of the button with the icon, but you cannot change the size of just the icon. The small and large directives don't work on the ion-icon components, only button. The size of the icon increases accordingly to the size of the button. Next, changing the colors. Ionic has 5 color presets built into it so you can customize the buttons. These colors are named as primary, secondary, danger, light, and dark. By default, all the buttons are blue in color. That is, the primary color is the default color. Let's try changing the color to secondary. These colors are named as primary, secondary, danger, light, and dark. By default, all the buttons are blue in color. That is, the primary color is the default color. Let's try changing the color to secondary. The color of the button changes to a green color. You can also set the color as danger, as we have also done with the nav bar on the top, and it changes the color of the button to red. Lastly, we can change the color to be dark or light, and it will change the color accordingly. You can also change the color of the icons by specifying the color attribute on the ion-icon component. Let's set the color of this icon to be danger and see how it looks. There we go. Similarly, you can modify the color of the fabs as well. Specify a color on the button element within the ion-fab or the ion-icon if you want to change the color of the icon. As for the size, all you can do is specify a mini directive on the button element to change its size to a smaller one. In this lecture, we've gone over playing with icons, colors, and sizes. In this lecture, and in the next few lectures, we will learn about some components in Ionic that we will use to take input from the user and to build forms. This lecture is all about using inputs in Ionic. We will start by cleaning this up. I will remove all this code that we have here. I will also change the title of the page to something more relevant, like forms. Creating an input component is very similar to using the HTML input element. But instead of using the input tag, you need to use ion-input. Just like the regular input HTML element, you can specify the type attribute and a placeholder as well.
make sure that you close the ion-input tag. This is unlike the regular HTML input element. This creates a very basic text input field where your users can enter some text. The keyboard will show up automatically when this input component is focused. To make sure this is a little bit more descriptive for the users, you can also add a label using the ion-label component. This gives the users a clue as to what should be entered in this field below. You can also have multiple of these. For example, you can have one for username and another for password. All you need to do is change the text on the label and change the type and placeholder for the second input. I will change the type to password and remove the placeholder completely. Now, this looks okay, but we can make it look a little better. To do so, all you need to do is wrap each set of ion-label and ion-input inside an ion-item component. We will learn more about ion-item in a later lecture. Let's see how it changes the look of our form here. Now, it looks like a form on a mobile device. The user can easily fill out this form, and it takes up less space than it was taking up before. We can also add some attributes or directives to the ion-label component to change how the labels and input are displayed to the user. By default, the label is fixed, which means that the label is to the left of the input field, and it is always displayed. You can explicitly mention the fixed directive, but it doesn't really make a difference. Another directive you can use is stacked. It makes the label stacked on top of the input field and reduces its size as well. It still takes up more vertical space than the fixed label, but it looks a bit better. Lastly, you can use the floating directive as well, which animates the label based on whether the corresponding field is focused or not. You should not use a placeholder when using floating labels. See how it animates the label when I select the input field. Wrapping the label and input in an ion-item groups them together and makes sure that the right label is animated when the input is selected. Finally, to complete the form, you can create another ion-item and add a button inside it. If you do not like this style, you can place the button as it is without wrapping it inside the ion-item. In this lecture, we learned about input text in Ionic to build forms, and add a button inside it. If you do not like this style, you can place the button as it is without wrapping it inside the ion-item. In this lecture, we learned about input text in Ionic to build forms. In the next, the regular HTML one for username and another to type. We can make but inside an ion-. To do so, all you need to do is wrap the label and change the type and placeholder for the second input. I will change the type to password and remove the placeholder completely. Now, this looks okay, but we can make it look a little better. To do so, all you need to do is wrap each set of ion-label and ion-input inside an ion-item component. We will learn more about ion-item in a later lecture. Let's see how it changes the look of our form here. Now, it looks like a form on a mobile device. The user can easily fill out this form, and it takes up less space than it was taking up before. We can also add some attributes or directives to the ion-label component to change how the labels and input are displayed to the user. By default, the label is fixed, which means that the label is to the left of the input field, and it is always displayed. You can explicitly mention the fixed directive, but it doesn't really make a difference. Another directive you can use is stacked. It makes the label stacked on top of the input field and reduces its size as well. It still takes up more vertical space than the fixed label, but it looks a bit better. Lastly, you can use the floating directive as well, which animates the label based on whether the corresponding field is focused or not. In this lecture, we will continue working on our form from the past lecture so that we can learn about how to use radio buttons and check. Checkboxes in Ionic. Let's have a look at how to work with checkboxes first. We will, as usual, create an ion-item. Inside this ion-item, we will create an ion-label, and this label will contain the text that will be displayed on the next checkbox. It could be anything, like Remember Me, since this looks like a login form. Now, create a checkbox. You will need to use the ion-checkbox component. That is all. It displays a checkbox right before the label. You can check it and then uncheck it, just like any other checkbox control. Very simple. You can also make sure that the checkbox is selected by default by setting a property on the ion-checkbox component called checked to be true. And now, when the app reloads, notice how the checkbox is checked. You can, of course, uncheck it if you want. Using the radio buttons is very similar to using checkboxes, with a few minor and obvious differences. First of all, let's replace the ion-checkbox component with the ion-radio component.
This displays a radio button instead of a checkbox, which is selected by default. But one radio button never makes sense, because the purpose of radio buttons is to give the user a choice between a number of available options. So let's create another radio button similar to this one. We want to also change the label for each of these so that it makes more sense. But we still have a problem. Both the radio buttons are behaving individually, but we want them to act as a group so that only one of them is selected at any point in time. To do that, we have to use an ion-list with the radio-group directive. This ensures that only one of the two options is selectable. Now, when you select the second radio button, the first one gets deselected, and vice versa. But the user may get confused about what yes and no represent here. So we need to add some textual header as well, which we can do using the ion-list-header component inside the ion-list. Here, we can add the text, remember me, and see how it looks here. In this lecture, we have seen how to use radio buttons and checkboxes in Ionic. In this lecture, we are going to learn how to use selects in Ionic. Selects help the user choose from some options from a list of many options. Let's see how to use them in Ionic. I will get rid of this radio button code that we wrote in the last lecture. To create a select in Ionic, we use the Ionic-select component, just the same way that we use other components. We create an ion-item, and inside it, use ion-label. Let the label be something like account type. We will create an ion-select after the ion-label. And within the ion-select opening and closing tags, we will create an ion-option component for each option. Let's create an option with the text customer, and then we will copy this and just change the text to administrator. Similarly, we will create two more options, editor and author. Now, when we tap or click on the select in the app, we are presented with an alert overlay that displays all four options, and we are free to choose any one. Once we choose the one we want, we will click on the OK button to set the value. Then, the selected value is displayed in the field after the select is closed. Even if you change the selection, the displayed text is updated accordingly. We can change the interface of the select by specifying the interface property on the ion-select component. This can contain one of three values, which are popover, action-sheet, and alert, which is the default one. Let's set the interface to action-sheet and see how it changes the interface of the select. You can see that instead of displaying the options as a popover, now all the options are displayed as an action sheet, which comes in from the bottom of the page. All the select, the interface to popover, action, sheet and alert, which is the default one. Let's set the interface to action-sheet and see how it changes the interface of the select. You can see that instead of displaying the options as a popover, now all the options are displayed as an action sheet, which comes in from the bottom of the page. You can either select any one of the options or click cancel. Setting the interface as alert brings back the default behavior. Setting the interface as popover will display the options in a drop-down menu, as it happens in most web apps. Let's see how it works. As you can see, the list of options is displayed right where the select is. We can also specify another property called multiple, which allows us to select multiple values from the list of options. Let's remove the interface property for now, and we will set multiple to options called multiple, which allows us to select multiple values from the list of options. Let's remove the interface property for now, and we will set multiple to true. Now, you can see that we are able to select more than one option, and the selected options are displayed in the field once you click or tap OK. Lastly, we can also modify the text on the OK and Cancel buttons using the properties OK text and Cancel text. I have changed the Cancel text to nah and OK text to yo, and see how it changes the text on the buttons. Ionic provides us a lot of controls over these components, so we can modify the look and feel of these components based on our application's needs. We will learn more about UI components in the next lectures. In this lecture, we're going to learn more about lists, which we have already touched a bit before. But in this video, we're going to dive into more details, as lists are one of the most used components in real-world apps. Ionic offers lots of list types and styles, and we will look at simple lists in this video, and we'll learn an advanced list type in the next one. So let's get started. We will start by cleaning.
There's so many. 2, 3, 4, and then we're done. How many? 39 minutes, 52 minutes. So once I get over this hurdle, once I get over the advanced user interface, advanced user interface, I'm chilling. I just want to take a little breather. doing like a quick game of chess to get your head back in the game. Where were we?
Up and making room to create lists on the page. We will start by using the ion-list component, and inside it, we will create an ion-item for each item in the list. We can create these dynamically based on an array or a data source, but for now, we are just going to keep it simple. You can also have buttons, but they also need to have an ion-item directive. Let's use buttons with the ion-item directive on them, using the buttons to help us define actions that can be taken when the user taps on a list item. So inside this button, let's put some text. As we save, you can see that our list now has one list item with the same text as defined on the buttons. Let's replicate this a few times and change the text on each one. You can now see the list actually taking some shape. Ionic lists are highly optimized and can deal easily with larger amounts of data. Like all other Ionic components, lists also come with predefined directives that change the way lists look and work. First, let's start by using the inset directive. This adds a little bit of margin to all the sides on the list. This comes in handy when you are not using the padding on your ion-content. In this case, the edges of the list touches with the edges of the screen, which generally doesn't look so good. If you are not using padding on the ion-content, then you can use inset, or you can use a combination that fits your needs. Another directive that we have is no lines. By default, the list items are separated with horizontal lines, which is required. But sometimes these are unwanted, especially when you want your app to look a certain way. You can use the no lines directive to hide these lines. As you can see, the lines between the list items are now gone. Let's bring back the padding now. You can use inset and no lines together as well. With ion-item, you also have an ion-item-divider, which can be used to separate a group of ion-items from each other. Let's see how it works. We create an ion-item-divider, let's say before the first ion-item and after the second ion-item. Add some text to these as well, and see how it looks. Dividers are used to segment the list into parts. This can be used in a huge number of ways. It helps to build a better user experience, or UX. Dividers are a little faded out, which gives an idea that they won't do anything if tapped or clicked. Next, we have list headers, which can be created using ion-list-header. We have used this before when learning about radio buttons. This gives a header. List headers, which can be created using ion-list-header. We have used this before and do UX. Dividers are used to segment the list into parts. This can be used in a huge number of ways. It helps to build a better user experience, or UX. Dividers are a little faded out, which gives an idea that they won't do anything if tapped or clicked. Next, we have list headers, which can be created using ion-list-header. We have used this before when learning about radio buttons. This gives a heading to the items below it. The usage is totally up to you. See how we can create a list header for a genre, and below the header, we have a few movies listed from that very genre. We can even have multiple headers. You can add icons to lists as well. All you need to do is use the ion-icon component with either item start or item end directives, and that's all. Let's add icons to a list item here. I will add an icon with the name rows and just the item start directive on it. And you can see how it looks. The icon is displayed on the left and the text goes to the right of the icon. You can even add buttons to the...
Dude, Ionic is so much better than Flutter. Holy shit. Dude, in Flutter, just to make an icon, you have to use like some fucking weird ass like code. It's so ugly. It looks like JavaScript. But this is closer to XML and therefore easier. Holy moly, this is a lot easier. Jesus. Wow. This is so much easier. Holy crap. True. Whew.
I'm creating a button here with the item in directive and adding an icon inside it. Adding the item-in directive on the button makes sure the icon or the button is displayed towards the right and the design looks just perfect. You can also here with the item in directive and adding an icon inside it. Adding the item-in directive on the button makes sure the icon or the button is displayed towards the right and the design looks just perfect. You can also use this in a number of ways. You can change the left icon to Facebook's logo and the right button's icon to share, which tells the user they can tap on this list item to share something on Facebook. Lastly, we have two list types that can display images as well. Avatar lists can be created using the Ion-Avatar component that will display circular images. All you need to do is define the IMG tag inside the Ion-Avatar component's opening and closing tags. You can see the image shown in a circle from the placehold.it service. We add a title, such as an H2, and some description as a paragraph. It starts to take shape. Of course, you'll have to define an item-start or an item-end on the Ion-Avatar as well, otherwise the design will break. I will do that as well. And you can see everything falls into place as I save. Try changing it to item-end and the avatar image moves to the right. You are free to use your creativity to create the design you want.
replicate these list items and see how the actual avatar list looks. Let's change back to the item-start so the avatar images are towards the left. You can also replace ion-avatar with ion-thumbnail. This will display images in squares instead of circles. Rest assured, everything works the same way in thumbnail and avatar lists. You can use item-start and item-end on thumbnail lists as well. You can add buttons and icons to the avatar and thumbnail list items as well. All you need is the button with ion-button directive and an icon or text defined inside it. Let's see how to do that. Create a button with the item-in directive so the button is towards the right of the list item, and then just add some text to it. You can see that the button is now displaying. It will look better with an icon instead of text though. Let's replace the text with an icon. You can see now the icon sitting to the right. Try playing around with lists yourself. Change the positions of the thumbnails from left to right and see how it looks. We can define special actions on these buttons. We will learn about these soon.
Whew.
In this lecture, we will learn how to create a more advanced kind of list called sliding lists. Sliding lists are just like regular lists that we have learned in the last video, but with a major UI improvement. Each item in a sliding list can slide to either the left or the right, revealing new options. Let's see how to create one of these and how the lists actually look. Let's delete all this code here and start by creating a regular list using ion-list component. Now, generally, inside here, we have ion-items for each item in the list, but since we're going to create a sliding list, we will instead use ion-item-sliding. Inside ion-item-sliding, we will have the regular ion-item that we have been using for a while now. Let's just create an ion-item with some simple text. And now we can see our ion-item in the app. It does nothing as of now. The next step is implementing the sliding feature on this list item. To do that, we will use ion-item-options. And remember that this does this inside the ion-item-sliding component after the ion-item. Inside ion-item-options, you can create buttons. So for now, I will just create one button with the text call on it. Save the file and let's see how it looks. In the app, you can see the list item looks the same, but as you slide it towards the left, a new button is revealed. This is the option button we created. We can perform any actions on the list or on the item by tapping on the button. This does not take space on the page and offers a nice UI. As you slide, the button is revealed, and as you slide back, the button hides again. Let's create a copy of this whole ion-item-sliding and see how two of these look. Just like the first one, you can slide the second list item as well. It works independently. Notice how the list item slides back to its normal initial state when you slide the other one. Now let's add another option button to both ion-item-sliding tags and see how these option buttons look. To distinguish between the two buttons easily, let's change their colors. I will also change the text on the second button option to be SMS. Now, when we slide, instead of one, we have two option buttons, one for call and the other one for SMS. These two buttons act independently and can be used to perform different actions. We will learn how to make these buttons work in a later lesson. We can also put icons on the buttons to make these option buttons look even better. I will replace the text call with a relevant icon. See how it looks better? Change the button type to clear, and now only the icon shows up. You're free to use all the creativity you want. You can customize it to look exactly how you want it to be. You can even modify the ion-item using the directives and components that we learned in the last lecture. Let's try using ion-avatar to create an avatar list item with an image on the left. And here we go. You can see the avatar image shows up, and the sliding is still operational. You need to practice to combine these components together and create the UI you want. In this lecture, we will learn about Ionic cards. Cards are one of the most important and widely used UI components in Ionic, particularly in Android apps. Nearly every app uses cards. Even if you use lists, you can put cards inside lists, as in Facebook, LinkedIn, and other modern apps. The card is a UI component that is a bounding box with a very subtle shadow. Let's see how to create cards in Ionic. To create a card, we use the Ionic-card component. Let's see how it looks if we put content directly inside the Ion-card component. The text displays inside the card, but there's no styling, and it doesn't look very good at all. You should always put content inside Ion-card-content. Let's try that. I will create an Ion-card-content inside the Ion-card. Now it looks perfect. The content is well positioned in the card. We will also use the Ion-card-header to display a title on the card. The card title is displayed in a slightly bigger text size. We can even put images in the card. By default, the images take up the full width of the card, leaving no padding. Let's see how that looks. I will just place an image from the placeholder service with a size of 300 by 200 pixels. You can use any image, which is wide enough to take up the card. Let's save the file and see how it looks. We can use lists inside cards to display some content. Let's create a list at the bottom of the card. This list will contain two items. Each item will have some text and an icon. Let's also add item-start to the icon to position the icon properly in the item to the left. For the second item, let's put the icon on the right using item-in. There we go. You can even modify the color of the card header and the card as well. All you need to do is use the color attribute on the card header, and the color of the header text changes. You can apply color to the card as well. Let's remove the color, and the card looks better in the light color. That's all there is to it. We just covered how to use cards in Ionic. In this lecture, we will learn how to create grids in Ionic. Grids let you define rows and columns. You have the flexibility of defining how you want your rows and columns. It adopts the Bootstrap 12-column grid system, which is a very popular web design framework. The grid is composed of 3 units: the grid, rows, and columns. We will start by creating a grid using the Ionic-grid component. Inside the Ionic grid, we use an ion-row, and each row will consist of an ion-call. There can be multiple ion-calls, one for each column in the row, and multiple ion-rows, one for each row in the grid. You can see that as I create the ion-call and put some text inside it, that it is displayed. Since we have just one column in the row, it takes up the whole row. Let's create another column using the same ion-call. I will just copy and paste the same column. And now, both columns take up equal space in the row. We cannot see the columns as the row now. Let's apply some CSS so that the columns are visible. Open up home.scss and apply style to the ion-call CSS element. Add a background color and some padding and align the text to the center. Save the file and close it. Now we can see the columns clearly. Adding some more columns will further reduce the space. See the CSS element. Add a background color and some padding and align the text to the center. Save the file and close it. Now we can see the columns clearly. Adding some more columns will further reduce the space taken up by each column in the same manner. All 3 columns now occupy 1/3 of the total space in the row. Let's increase the text in the column and see how it shows. As you can see, the content remains constrained inside the column, but takes up more vertical space to fit in. We can also specify the width of the column using the directives call dash followed by a number ranging from 1 to 12. A call -6 directive will ensure that the column takes up 6 columns per row. There are a total of 12 in each row. Similarly, a call -4 directive will ensure the column takes up 1/3 of the row. Let's add call -12 to the first column. And as expected, it takes up all 12 columns in the row, and the other columns are automatically moved to the next row. Let's change it to call -6. And now the first column takes up half the row. Since we have not specified the widths for the other columns, they take up the remaining space, equally dividing it. Now let's change it to call -2 for the first column, call -6 for the second column, and call -4 for the last one. Note that the sum of the column widths always has to add up to 12. Otherwise, the rows can show some unwanted layouts. Let's add a black border to the SCSS file so we can clearly see the border of the columns to better understand. Now you can see the border of each column. Clearly, the first column is the thinnest, as it only has 2 columns allocated. The second one is the widest, since it has 6 columns allocated, and the third one has the remaining 4 allocated. You can change these numbers, making sure that the sum is always 12. Let's create another row. You can define a completely different set of columns for this row, and it does not affect the layout of the first row. Each row is independent of other rows. There is a lot more to Ionic grids, but we have covered the most important concepts.
Halfway there. First thing I do once I'm done is hit the gym. My God, I am so mentally exhausted right now, but we have to keep going. Oof.
In this section, we're going to take a step further and learn about and learn about more complex UI components in Ionic. These components need us to write code in TypeScript to make them work. We will start by learning how to use TypeScript and Angular to interact with components from the code. We will learn to execute our code on the click of a button. Next, we will learn how to display loading, alert, prompts, and many other UI elements to the user. We will also understand the best use case for each one. We will also learn about Toast and action sheets in Ionic. Next, we will learn about pages in Ionic. No application is just one page, so we will learn how to create new pages in Ionic and navigate to them. We will understand the navigation stack used in Ionic. Finally, we will learn about modals and popovers. These are overlay components that are just like pages, but are displayed on top.
Let me do REST APIs first.
In this section, we will learn about using REST APIs in Ionic. We will also start working on a real-world Ionic app called Weather Ionic, which we will move on to releasing in the Google Play Store. We will start by understanding what is REST, and what are the basics of REST. We will then learn how to consume REST services and APIs in Ionic using Angular's HTTP modules. We will consume an API that provides weather details. We will integrate this API in our Ionic app called Weather Ionic. We will make our app display the weather information for any city in the app. Finally, we will finish the app by adding some finishing touches so that it is ready to be released in the Google Play Store. In this lecture, we will learn how to make HTTP requests in Ionic by getting and sending data to a remote server, web service, or an API. Let's get started. We will start by creating a new Ionic app called Weather Ionic. And you can see this brand new Ionic app was just created. I will go ahead and open this project folder in Visual Studio Code and run it in the browser using Ionic Serve. To use HTTP features in Ionic or Angular, we have to use the HTTP module, which is not included by default in Ionic or Angular. We will have to import the HTTP module from an external module called @angular/HTTP. First things first, we will import the HTTP module into the app.module.ts file, and then pass it into the imports array. This is very important. Any external module that we use in our app needs to be passed into the imports array. Save the file and close it. Now, head over to the page where you want to make an HTTP request, and open the TypeScript. Now, head to be passed into the imports array. Save the file and close it. Now, head over to the page where you want to make an HTTP request, and open the TypeScript file for that page. For us, it's going to be the home.ts file. Import the HTTP class from the @Angular HTTP module, and then instantiate it by passing it into the constructor as a parameter. Let's call the instance variable as HTTP with a lower lowercase h. Now we are ready to make our very first HTTP request. And inside the constructor, we will do that. Start by typing in this.http, and you will get a number of options to choose from. You can make all kinds of HTTP requests, including post, get, put, delete, and more. For now, we'll just go ahead with a GET request. Select or type in the method name GET. Then the GET function takes in a number of parameters, but the most important one is the URL, which is where you want to make the request to. For now, we want to use a free web service called JSON Placeholder. This service provides us some dummy JSON data to play with. So pass in the URL http://jsonplaceholder.typecode.com/users. Call the subscribe function on this. The subscribe function registers the handlers or the callback functions, which will be executed when the HTTP request either succeeds or fails. The first callback is the success callback and is executed when the request succeeds. It gets the data returned as a result of the network request as the parameter. The second parameter is the error callback, which is executed if the request fails due to some errors. The caused error is returned to the callback as a parameter. For now, we will log the data as well as the error to the console. Let's see what we get. Now, if you look closely in the browser's console window, you can see that we get a log message. This is actually the response we got from the web service JSON placeholder. Click on the little triangle to expand the object, and you will see the information we are getting. The one that we're interested in is the underscore body object, which contains the data that we need. To get to this data, all we have to do is call the JSON function on the data object, and we get the data as JSON. Let's see it in the console. This time, you will see that we get an array of 10 elements logged to the console. Each element in this array contains dummy information about a hypothetical user. So if you expand it and have a closer look, you can see that we got a JSON object that contains values for address, company, ID, name, phone, username, and more. Nested inside the address, we have city, street, and other related information. Feel free to explore this information. Next step is to display the users on the page. Start by creating an array called users. This is going to be the array of type any. And inside the success callback, save the returned array of users, which is data.json. Inside the users array. Now, we can use the users array to display the user's information to the page using an ng4. Head over to the home.html file and start by creating an ion-list. Inside this list, we will have an ion-item for each user. Create an ion-item, and on this ion-item, we will use an ng4 to loop over the user's array. Let's call the object as user, which contains one element of the user's array at a time. We will use interpolation to display the names of the users. Use double curly braces to display the name using user.name. Save the file, and immediately you will see the names of the users displayed in a list on the page. All this data is retrieved from a remote web service using a network request. In this lecture, we learned how to make an HTTP request in Ionic by successfully making our very first request. In this lecture, we will learn about how to fetch data from a web API.
Okay, so that's API, and then publishing should be easy. I'll just take notes, and then the last thing I'll need is advanced UI. Whew. 949, not bad, not bad, not bad. Not bad, 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 not bad. Almost there. Almost there. This is so much easier, dude. So much easier. Fuck. Like a million times easier. Than fucking Flutter. Yeah. Wow, wow, we wow. Can finally hit the gym once I knock this out. I mean, I can hit the gym right now and then do this tomorrow.
And display the information retrieved in the app. Nowadays, all mobile apps use web APIs, so this lecture is a very important one and will help you understand how real apps work. Before we start, I would like to introduce you to a weather API that we will be using to build our very own weather app called Weather Ionic. This API is called Open Weather Map API. It is free for limited usage. All you need to do is sign up for an account with the Open Weather Map at https://openweathermap.org/API and get an API key. You will need this API key in the next step. Coming back to the app, we will start by changing the URL in the get function in the home.ts file to one that points to the Open Weather Map API. The URL will look like this, starting with the http://api.openweathermap.org/data/a version number/weather, then a question mark followed by some parameters. Each parameter should be separated by an ampersand. You can see that the URL points to the host api.openweathermap.org, and we have two passed-in query parameters in the URL. The first is the Q parameter, which contains the name of the city for which we need weather details, and the second parameter is the app ID parameter, which contains the API key that you got in the last step. Both parameters are mandatory. Since we will get a JSON object as a response of this GET request, we will also modify the related variables just a bit. Instead of users, we will now have weather info, which will be an object instead of an array. We will also change the name of the variable down here as well. Now, we can access the data that we will get from the API in the HTML using the object weather.info. Before that, let's have a look at the console and see what exactly we are getting. In the console, you will see that a JSON object is logged. It contains a lot of information related to the weather of London, which we have passed in as a parameter. We have nested JSON objects like clouds, cord, main, sys, weather, and wind. Let's start working on a UI and show some of this information on the page. Start by changing the title in the navigation bar to the name of the app, which is Weather Ionic. Next, I will get rid of the ion-list that we created in the last lecture, and instead, I will create an ion-card. I will add the no margin directive as well to remove the extra margin on the sides of the card. Besides this, the ion-card, I will create an ion-item-divider with color set to light and the text to location details. This will act as the heading for the information below it. After the divider, I will create an ion-item for displaying the name of the city, which is accessible via the weatherinfo.name. We will use interpolation to display its value. You can see that in the app on the right that we have the name of the city is now displayed, London. Next, we are going to display the name of the country, which is stored inside the weatherinfo.sys.country property. So let's create an ion-item for that as well. I will copy this one and paste it and make the required changes. You can see that an error occurred. That is because in the weather info, there is no property called sys as the page loads. It takes a while for the network request to complete and fetch the data from the API, hence the error. We can avoid this error by using an ngIf on this ion-item. This ion-item will only be displayed if the value of the weatherinfo.sys is not undefined. Make sense? Now, the error goes away, and we get the country identifier just as we wanted. Next, I will create another ion-item to display the geographical coordinates of the city, the latitude and longitude, which are accessible via the weatherinfo.coord object. We will use interpolation to display the weatherinfo.coord.lat and the weatherinfo.coord.lon. Again, we will have to use an ngIf to avoid errors. Save the file and have a look at the app. You can now see the latitude and longitude as well. Further down the page, we will create another card to display information like temperature, pressure, and humidity, which can be accessible via the weatherinfo.main object. So create another ion-card and an ion-item-divider. Inside it, display the divider text weather details. Just below the ion-item-divider, create one ion-item for temperature, pressure, and humidity each. The temperature can be accessed from the weatherinfo.main.temp. I will also append the text Kelvin, as that is the unit for the temperature. We will also change the units for pressure and humidity, respectively. I will also have to use an ngIf to avoid errors. We will repeat the same process again and create another ion-card with an ion-item-divider and an ion-item. The values we will display are wind, speed, and direction. So far, we have a lot of information being displayed, which is good. We will add an image of the map of the location. We will use the Google Maps Static Image API to get an image of the map of the location. Right at the top, just inside the ion-card, we will create another ion-item-divider and an IMG or image tag below it. The source for the image will point to the Google Maps Static Image API. You can see that the URL we passed in is the name of the city and the size of the image as parameters. As you save, you will see the image of the map on the right in the app. Looks great, right? Now that we are getting a lot of information in the app, including text and images, we will add some improvements to this app in the next lecture. In this lecture, we will add an input field for the user to enter the name of the city for which they want to see weather details, and also implement a loading controller to show a loading indicator while the request is being made. We will start by creating a new ion list with an ion-item inside it. Inside the ion-item, we will create an ion-input. It will use a placeholder text city name, and it will be bound to a variable called city name using ngModel. This input field will be used to get the name of the city from the user. After the ion-list, we will create a button that will be used to fetch the weather information from the API. This button, thus, needs to be bound to a function. We will bind its click event to the getData function that is already created from the last two lectures. Since we have used the city name as the ngModel, we will need to create a similar variable up on the top in the home.ts file and initialize it to the default value, say similar variable up on the features. Since we have used the city name as the ng model, we will need to create a similar variable up on the top in the home.ts file and initialize it to the default value, say London. We will also have to modify the URL to include this .cityname instead of the static text as the value for the query parameter q. Save the file. Let's see how it works so far. As soon as you save, you will see that the input text is already filled in with the text London. The page displays the weather information for the same. That is because we have set a default value for the city name variable. Let's change it to another city's name, like Madrid, and click on the Show Weather button. The page now shows weather information for Madrid. Awesome, right? But the map is still showing the image for London. Let's fix that as well. Head over to the home.html file, and from the URL or src for the image, replace the static text for London with the interpolated value of city name. That's it. Let's test it again. Enter Paris in the text field, and click on the button, and you'll get the image for Paris's map, and the weather information for Paris is also shown. Try another Madrid, and click on the Show Weather button. The page input text is already include this .cityname instead of the static. Static text as the value for the query parameter q. Save the file. Let's see how it works so far. As soon as you save, you will see that the input text is already filled in with the text London. The page displays the weather information for the same. That is because we have set a default value for the city name variable. Let's change it to another city's name, like Madrid, and click on the Show Weather button. The page now shows weather information for Madrid. Awesome, right? But the map is still showing the image for London. Let's fix that as well. Head over to the home.html file, and from the URL or src for the image, replace the static text for London with the interpolated value of city name. That's it. Let's test it again. Enter Paris in the text field, and click on the button, and you'll get the image for Paris's map, and the weather information for Paris is also shown. Try another city. And it just works perfectly. Lastly, let's implement the loading controller to display a loading spinner to the user while the app is getting data from the API. Go ahead and import loading controller from the Ionic-Angular module and initialize it by injecting it into the constructor. Just like before, we use the HTTP GET request to the API inside the GetData function. We will display the loading spinner to the user just before we use the HTTP GET request to the API inside the GetData function. I will pass nothing to the create function to keep it simple. You can use the properties that we discussed in the loading controller lecture. Next, present it to the user. Once the request succeeds or fails, inside the success and error callbacks, we will dismiss it. Let's test it with the app one last time. Now, you can see that every time the app tries to talk to the API, a loading spinner is displayed to the user, which tells the user that the app is working in the background. This is good user experience. Now that we have completed the app weather Ionic, we are ready to build this app and release it. we will build this app for Android and make it release ready for the Google Play Store. We will start by creating a release APK. Then, we will sign that APK using the utilities that the Android SDK provides. Finally, we will head over to the Google Play console and add our app there. We will fill in all the required information and submit the app. By the end of this section, you will have your own app in the Play Store. I'm sure you're very excited. So let's get started. In this lecture, we will take the first steps in building our app for Android, further to be released in the Android Play Store. We will build a release APK, or Android package file. Make sure that you have the Android SDK set up on your machine. Before we actually start building the app, we need to make sure that it is build ready or market ready. The first step in doing so would be to create some nice images. We need 2 images as of now. The first one would be the splash screen, and the second one would be the icon image. You can find the factory images in the resources folder in your project folder. As you can see, we have a splash image and an icon file. I have already created an icon and a splash image for my weather app, so I will just copy them into the resources folder for the project. The dimensions of these files are very specific. An icon image needs to be at least 192 by 192 pixels, and the splash image should be at least 1200 by 1200 pixels. However, larger the images, the better. I will replace the factory files with these files. Once you have your image files in the resources folder, come back to Visual Studio Code where our project is open. In the terminal, type in Ionic space Cordova space platform space add space Android. This command adds the Android platform to our Ionic. Project. This also creates the image assets for Android devices using our icon and splash images. As you can see, it is uploading the images to the Ionic servers, where the images will be processed and converted to appropriate sizes for various Android devices. This might take a minute or two. If you look in the Android folder in Resources, you will see that we have icons in various sizes, and the same for the splash image. This is because Android devices come in many sizes and resolutions, and our app needs to work on all of them. You can also use the command Ionic space resources space -f to build these resources again, forcefully, if you happen to change your icon or splash images. We are ready to build the release APK. All you have to do is type in Ionic space Cordova space build space Android space -- release space -- prod. The -- prod flag is completely optional. It results in a more optimized and smaller file, but you need to pass in -- release to generate the APK. Let's wait for this to complete. As you can see, it's given me the path to the generated APK file called Android release unsigned APK. Let's have a look at the said path. And here we see that we have an APK file. Now that we have built a release APK for Weather Ionic, we are now ready to take the next step, which is to sign the APK file. In this lecture, we will sign the APK file that we built in the last lecture. First of all, make sure that you have the environment variable set up properly and you've added the Android Studio folders to your path. If you didn't get that, check the attached resources for this lecture. Basically, check if you have the Build Tools, Platform Tools, and Tools folder added to your path. These folders are in your Android SDK folder. Also, make sure that you have the bin folder of your JDK installation folder added to your path. Lastly, make sure that the Android Home variable is set up pointing to the SDK location. Okay, with all that configured, let's come back to VS Code and get started. The folders are in your Android SDK folder. Also, make sure that you have the bin folder of your JDK installation folder added to your path. Lastly, make sure that the Android Home variable is set up pointing to the SDK location. Okay, with all that configured, let's come back to VS Code and get started by creating a signing key. We will use the Key Tool application, which comes with the JDK, to generate a we will configure Android Home variable is set up pointing to the SDK location. Okay, with all that configured, let's come back to VS Code and get started by creating a signing key. We will use the Key Tool application, which comes with the JDK, to generate a secure key store. The command is keytool space -keygen space -v space -keystore space weatherionic.keystore, that is the name of the keystore file, space -alias space weatherionic, which is our alias name, space keyalg, which is the key algorithm, space RSA space -key size space 2048 space -validity space 10,000. Within that command, the weather Whether Ionic is the name of the key store file that will be created. The other parameters are pretty much standard. When you press enter, you will need to provide a password for your key store. You won't see it as you type it, so be very careful. Remember all your passwords because there's no way to recover lost or forgotten passwords. Then confirm it. Once that is done, it will prompt you for some basic information about you and your organization. Lastly, type yes to confirm all the information you entered. Next, you will be prompted to provide in a password to your key, whether Ionic. You can press enter to use the same password as your key store. For now, I'll go ahead and press enter. You're free to make the choice here. You can see that we now have a new file in the file tree in the left called weatherionic.keystore. This is the actual key store file, and you need to keep it safe and secure. You will need it every time you build this app or update the app. You're free to make the choice here. You can see that we now have a new file in the file tree in the left called weatherionic.keystore. This is the actual key store file, and you need to keep it safe and secure. You will need it every time you build this app or update the app. Now, you will need to use the jar signer utility to sign the APK that we built in the last video using the key that we just generated. The command will look something like this: jar signer space dash verbose space dash sigalg space SHA1 with RSA space dash digest alg space SHA1 space dash keystore space weatherionic.keystore. Then the path to the unsigned released APK file space weatherionic, which is our alias. As you can see, you need to provide the path to the APK file, the key store, and the alias name of the key that you want to use to sign this very APK. Go ahead and press enter. You'll be prompted to enter the password for the key store, and in a fraction of a second, your APK will be signed. Next, and the last step, will be to verify the signed APK, and to generate a new uploadable APK. To do that, we need to use the zipalign utility. The command is zipalign-v space 4 space, and then the path to the unsigned release APK file, space, and then a new name for the APK, weatherionic.apk. This command, again, takes the path path to the APK file that we just signed, and the name of a new file to be generated, which is weatherionic.apk in this case. Press enter, and immediately you'll see a new file in the file tree on the left. You're done. You just need to upload this APK file, weatherionic.apk, to the Play Store to publish your app. In the next lecture, we will learn how to upload the APK file to the Play Store, along with other assets and settings to publish the app on the Play Store. google.com/apps/publish. You will need to pay a one-time fee of $25, at least as of the recording of this course. Once you've done that, you will land on a page like this that shows all your published apps. Click on the Create App button on the top right corner. You will be prompted for your default language and the app's name. Let's call our app Weather Ionic, and then click on Create. On the very next page, you'll have to provide all the necessary details about your app. Start by writing in a short description of the app, and then a full description. Keep in mind that this description will be publicly visible to everyone visiting your app on the Play Store. Scroll down, and here you'll need to provide some graphic assets for your app. A minimum of 2 screenshots, a high-resolution icon, and a feature graphic are required. The dimensions of each of these assets is mentioned right here on this page. I have already created these assets, so I will start by selecting the screenshots first. Next, I need to provide a 512 by 512 pixel icon. I will select that as well. Finally, I will select the 1024 by 500 pixel feature graphic. You can use the graphic editing software of your choice to create these, or hire a graphic designer for the job. There are a few other graphic assets that are optional, so I'm not going to worry about them right now. Down here, you will need to select a category for your app. Along with the category, you will also need to fill in a questionnaire to get the content rating certificate. We will do that in the next steps. At the bottom, just provide an email, a website, a phone, and a privacy policy URL. I will provide the privacy policy later, so I will checkmark this option right here. Scroll to the top and make sure you click on the Save Draft button, or you might lose your changes. As the changes are resaved, you can see that the menu on the left shows a green check mark by the store listing, which means that we are done with this section. Next, click on the App Releases section. Click on Manage Production. Click on Create Release. And here you will need to upload your APK file that we generated in a previous lecture. Click Continue and browse for the APK file. Then wait while your APK file is uploaded. If everything goes well, you should see the release name and the APK file will be added. You can provide some version-specific information here as well. Click on Save, and then click on Review. But you cannot submit the app for review because we still need 2 sections to fill in. Let's do that as well. Start by selecting the Content Rating section. Click Continue, and provide the required information, and select the app category. Based on the selected category, you'll be required to answer certain questions about your app and its content. I will select Utility/Productivity as the app category, and then answer the presented questions. Once you answer the questions, click on the Calculate Rating button, and then click on the Apply Rating after going through the rating your app gets. For us, it is an app that everyone can use and has no restricted content. We will click on Apply Rating. And we are done with this section as well. Next, we will head over to Price and Distribution section. Here, you will need to define the price of your app, regions it will be downloadable in, and some very basic questions. Whether Ionic will be a free app available in all countries. Once done, save. Now, since we have completed all the sections, we need to go back to the App Releases section again. Click on Edit Release, and scroll down and select Review. And finally, you get the button that does it all. Click on the Start Rollout to Production button. Click on Confirm, and then wait for the app to be approved and available in the Play Store. You'll be notified of the status via emails. Once the app is published, it will look like this in the Google Play Store. All the screenshots and graphic assets, along with the textual description, are here. You can now share the app with friends and family. If you followed along, congratulations. You have your very own app out there.
Oh my, oh my, oh my, oh my. I've been up for a long time. Oh my, oh my, oh my. I've been up for a long time.
So far, we have built several user interfaces, and in this video, we'll learn how to read and write the information from input fields and do something on the click or tap of a button. Let's start. I will simply start by creating a very basic login form with 2 fields. The first field will be for the username.
Oh my, I'm on a flight now. So hard. Mama kicked me out the house now. Oh my. Oh, fuck me, dude. Fuck.
and the second one will be for the password. As usual, we will want to use an ion-list component, and inside it, we will use an ion-item for each field. Before that, let's create an ion-list-header to display a nice header on the top of the list that says login. Now, we will create an ion-item for the username field. It will have a label and an input of the type text. As we save the file, you can see the form showing up in the app on the right. The user can type their username here in the input field. Let's make this a little bit more attractive and add the following floating directive on the field. Let's copy and paste the ion-item for the password field. I will change the label text to password and the input type to password as well. Now, we will create two buttons outside the list. The first button will be the login button, and the second button will be the cancel button. Let's create them. We will create a button with the text login. Let's make it a block button so it takes up all the width available to it. Replicate this button for the cancel button and just change the text on the button to cancel. Now, to put these buttons side by side, we will use ion-grid. Create a grid using ion-grid and inside it an ion-row, and finally two ion-calls. Put a button in each. To distinguish between these buttons, let's make the cancel button an outline button. The login form is ready. Let's try using it. I will fill out the username field and the password field and click the login button. Obviously, nothing will happen. We do not see anything happen in the app or in the browser's console. To add logic, head over to the home.ts file, which contains the TypeScript code for this page. We will write all the code here in the TS file. For now, we will hook up the login button to a function. We want a function to be called when we click on this button, so we will bind the click event of this button to a function. To do that, we will need to put the name of the event, click, inside a pair of parentheses, and then pass in the name of the function as a parameter. We will pass login as the name of the function. If you need to pass in any parameters, obviously nothing will happen. We do not see anything happen in the app or in the browser's console. To add logic, head over to the home.ts file, which contains the TypeScript code for this page. We will write all the code here in the TS file. For now, we will hook up the login button to a function. We want a function to be called when we click on this button, so we will bind the click event of this button to a function. To do that, we will need to put the name of the event, click, inside a pair of parentheses, and then pass in the name of the function as a parameter. We will pass login as the name of the function. If you need to pass in any parameters to this function, you can do that, but for now, let's keep it simple. Now, if you click the login button, you will run into an error because we have not created the login function and TypeScript cannot find it. We will create this function in the home.ts file now. All you need to do is write login as the name of the function. If you need to pass in any parameters to this function, you can do that, but for now, let's keep it to a function. To do that, we will need to put the name of the event, click, inside a pair of parentheses, and then pass in the name of the function as a parameter. We will pass login as the name of the function. If you need to pass in any parameters to this function, you can do that, but for now, let's keep it simple. Now, if you click the login button, you will run into an error because we have not created the login function and TypeScript cannot find it. We will create this function in the home.ts file now. All you need to do is write the name of the function followed by a pair of parentheses with any parameters if any are needed. We do not have any parameters as of now. We will just log a simple message to the console. So, we will see a message logged to the browser's console whenever we click on the button. Let's try that. When I click on the login button, now, you will see that I get the same message logged to the console. Let's follow the same process to hook up the cancel button to another function called cancel. Next, create the cancel function in the home.ts file, just in the same way we created the login function. This time, we will change the message accordingly. If you test this out, you'll get the messages in the console accordingly. Now, we will take a step further and access the value in the input fields, username and password. To do that, we first have to create two global variables to hold their values inside the class, just before our constructor. A variable called username as type string, with an empty string as the default value. We will do the same for password. All these global variables are accessible in all functions in this class, and in the HTML file as well. To bind these variables to the input fields respectively, we will use a directive provided by Angular called ngModel. We will define ngModel on the input field and pass it a parameter, which is the name of the variable that will hold its value. This will be the same name that we use to create a variable in the TS file, username. That is not all. ngModel does two-way binding, which means that if you change the value in this input field, then the value of the variable in this code will be updated. And also, if you change the value from the code, it will be reflected in the input field as well. We will see that in action in just a moment. For now, just wrap ngModel with a pair of parentheses first, and then a pair of square brackets. This is how two-way binding works. We will do the same for the password input field and just change the name of the variable to password. This value from the code, which means that if you
so close to being done. Ugh. Mira todo el mundo sabe, That's right. Oh no. 50 minutes, god damn it.
Change the value in this input field, then the value of the variable in this code will be updated. And also, if you change the value from the code, it will be recode means PS file. Model on the input field provided by to bind these variables to the input class, and in the HTML file as well. To bind these variables, all do the same as type string, with an empty string as the default value. We will do the same for password. All these global variables are accessible in all functions in this class, and in the HTML file as well. To bind these variables to the input fields respectively, we will use a directive provided by Angular called ngModel. We will define ngModel on the input field and pass it a parameter, which is the name of the variable that will hold use string as the default value, called username as type string. with an empty string as the default value. We will do the same for password. All these global variables are accessible in all functions in this class, and in the HTML file as well. To bind these variables to the input fields respectively, we will use a directive provided by Angular called ngModel. We will define ngModel on the input field and pass it a parameter, which is the name of the variable that will hold its value. This will be the same name that we use to create a variable in the TS file, username. That is not all. ngModel does two-way binding, which means that if you change the value in this input field, then the value of the variable in this code will be updated. And also, if you change the value from the code, it will be reflected in the input field as well. We will see that in action in just a moment. For now, just wrap ngModel with a pair of parentheses first, and then a pair of square brackets. This is how two-way binding works. We will do the same for the password input field and just change the name of the variable to password. We want to display the value of username. So let's log it to the console inside the login function. To access username, you should use this.username. This here refers to the current class. Similarly, log the password to the console as well. Let's try this now. Now when I click on the login button, we get two blanks to the console logs because the input fields are blank, and thus the value of the username and password variables. Let's fill in some text for each of the fields and try again. I will enter some text in the username field and click login. As expected, I get the username logged to the console, but the password is still blank. So let's fill in that as well. And this time, I get both the username and the password logged. The cancel button is where we left it. It just logs this message to the console. So let's make it clear these input fields. To do that, all we need to do is reset the value of the username and password variables. That's it. Now, when you click on the cancel button, the value of the variable will be reset and hence the input field will become empty. This is something that two-way binding does for us.
Phenomenal. Phenomenal.
In the last lecture, we learned about how to use TypeScript code to interact with the buttons and text input fields. We learned how to use ngModel and global variables to access and modify the values in the views as well. In this lecture, we're going to do the same thing, but with some more Ionic components like checkboxes, selects, and radio buttons. We will proceed from where we left off in the last video. Since we have a nice looking login form here to which we are going to add some more elements and make it a sign up form instead. We will start by changing the title of the list to sign up. We will add another input field using the same combination of ion-item, ion-label, and ion-input for confirm password. We will change the text on the label and the name of the model accordingly. Next, we will build an ion-select that will allow users to select the user type. We will give two options to the user to choose from. Start by creating an ion-item, and inside of it, we will create an ion-label. The text in the ion-label will be user type, or you can change it to whatever you like. Then we will use ion-select to create a select component, and it will have the options defined inside it using ion-option component. We will define two options, admin and user. We will also define value for each option, which contains the actual value we will receive and process in the code. As you can see, the select is now working. We can select any of these options. The next step is to bind ion-select to a variable as well, using ngModel. So let's do that. We will use ngModel just in the same way we used it in the last lecture. We will pass in a variable name, which will be user type. Again, you can do this however you like. Now, we need to create the same variable globally here in the TypeScript class. So here, we will do that. This time, we will specify its type to be any, and we will not even specify a default value for the variable. Finally, we will log the value to the console on the click of the button. Let's test this out. When I click on Login, without selecting anything in the select field, I get an undefined, which is obvious, since no value is selected. The value of the model will be undefined. Let's select admin, and try again. This time, we get the console log that says admin, which is the value we selected. Select user. And the value of the corresponding ion dash
Hey David, how's it going? Pay my dues on this side, flipping the bricks on the side. Made it out on the side, all my dues on the side. To side, to side, to side. Flipping the bricks on the side. Made a dive on the side. Always, always decide, 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 decide. Oh, yay.
Option will be logged to the console. This is the way we can access the values of selects in TypeScript code in Ionic. Moving on. Now we will do the same experiment with radio buttons. Real quick, to save time, I will paste in code for a radio group outside the existing list that we've been working on to keep it simple. We have a radio-group directive defined on the ion-list, and each ion-item consists of an ion-radio, with the value just like we did with the ion-option. In the app, you can see that we get the required UI, and the user can select any one of those options, which are male and female. We will again define an ng model on the ion-list with the radio group directive. Let's call this as Ginger. And to pass in the name of a variable, we will create our TypeScript code. Real quick, we will head over to the home.ts and create a variable globally with the same name and define its type to be any and no default value. Finally, on the click of the login button, let's log its value to the console as well. Let's see what we get. If you select female, female, which is its value, will be logged to the console, and if you select male, male will be logged to the console. However, if you select none of the two options, you will get an undefined. Lastly, let's learn to interact with checkboxes. Inside our list with all the other input items, we will create another ion-item with an ion-label and an ion-checkbox. Let's say this checkbox allows the user to specify if they want to receive notifications or not. If the user wants notifications, they can checkmark it. Otherwise, they can leave it unchecked. ng model will need to define on the checkbox and on the value of the ng model variable either to be true or false for checkboxes. If they are checked, the value is changed to true. If they are unchecked, the value will be false. We will define the variable of the ng model to be notifications, and create a variable with the same name in the TS class. Its type will be Boolean. You can use any as type as well, and we do not specify the default value. Finally, logging it to the console. As expected, the initial value is undefined. If you check it, the value is changed to true. If you uncheck it, the value is changed to false. You can use the checked property as well, but for now, this is how we're going to use the ng model on checkboxes. We will dive into more complex Ionic UI components in the upcoming lectures. In this lecture, we will learn how to display a loading animation to the user. This is really helpful when the app is busy doing something like fulfilling a network request or doing something that takes time. It displays a nice animation to the user and signifies the app is busy doing something and that the user needs to wait. The components we have been working with up until now are HTML-based UI components, but Ionic offers a lot of components that do not require any HTML to be written to the page's HTML file. Loading controller is one such component. It only requires some TypeScript code to work. All these components that are used with the help of TypeScript code require to be imported from the Ionic-Angular module. To import, just add the loading controller to the import statement at the top of the page. Make sure you're importing from the Ionic-Angular module. Once you import the loading controller, you will need to pass it into your constructor to create an object. It is as simple as declaring a variable, but you just do it as a parameter in the constructor. All you have to do is type public, then any name that you want to use for using this feature in this page. I will use loading controller with a lowercase l. This is a common nomenclature. Then just specify its type to be loading controller. It's as simple as that. Now you are ready to use loading controller. Let's use it in our login function so that the loading spinner is displayed when the login button is clicked. So I will start by typing in this.loadingcontroller.create and then store that in a variable called loading. We are basically creating a loading controller instance and storing it in an object for later access. Using loading, we can now show it or hide it. To show it, all we have to do is call the function present on loading. It will display the loading spinner to the user. Let's see it in action. As I click on the login button, the loading spinner animation shows up. It only has a spinner, which is animating, and it will be displayed indefinitely because I have not yet written the code to hide it. Let's say, after 3 seconds, we will use a simple setTimeout function of JavaScript. It takes in the function to be executed as the first parameter, and the time after which the function will be executed as the second parameter. The function to hide the loading spinner will be loading.dismiss, and the second parameter will be 3000 for 3000 milliseconds. Let's see this in action. Now, when I click on the login button, the loading spinner is shown for 1, 2, 3 seconds, and then it goes away. We have the option of customizing the loading screen to some extent. To customize, you can pass in a JSON object as a parameter to the create function. Let's do that. Here, you can specify a content and a spinner property. The content can be used to add some text or even HTML to the loading dialog. Let's add some text here. And now you see that we have a loading dialog along with text with the spinner. Cool. Next, let's modify the spinner as well. By default, it shows the iOS spinner, but there are 5 other spinner animations that Ionic provides, including bubbles, circles, crescent, dots, and iOS-small. Each one has its unique look. You can even remove the spinner completely by specifying hide as the spinner's property value. And now, if you check, the spinner is gone, and we only get to see the content text. Try this out yourself. Play around with all the spinners and try putting some HTML content in the content. This lecture was all about loading controller in Ionic. We will get to use this in a real application as all the spinner get to see the spinner's property value. And now, if you check, the spinner is gone, and we only get to see the content text. Try this out yourself. Play around with all the spinners and try putting some HTML content in the content. This lecture was all about loading controller in Ionic. We will get to use this in a real application later in this course. In this lecture, we're going to learn about the alert controller in Ionic. Alert controller is used to display alerts, confirmations, and prompt dialogues to the user. There are multiple ways you can use alerts in your apps. We will look at the ways we can create and display alerts, prompts, and confirmations to the user. I will start by cleaning up a bit so I can get more room to create more buttons. I will remove a few fields from here and add 2 new buttons. I will modify the text on the login button for now and change it to loading, and then change the text of the new button that we just created to be alert. I will also change the names of the functions that these buttons are bound to. I will bind the alert button to a function called alert that I will create in a few moments. I will also change the name of the login function to be loading to make it more relevant. We will do the same in the TS file as well. We will create the alert function. And now you will see that when I click the alert button, no errors show up, which means that the binding is working fine. Just as we use the loading controller, we will have to import the alert controller from the same Ionic Angular module, and then pass it in as a parameter to the constructor. We will instantiate it as alert controller, here using the same nomenclature as we discussed in the last video. Coming back to the alert function, we will start by typing in this.alertcontroller.create and saving the reference as a variable called alert. Now, we have to pass in a JSON object as a parameter to the create function. Unlike the loading controller, this is not optional here. So, we will create a JSON object and start by specifying a few properties. First one is the title, which will be displayed at the top of the dialog in a larger font. You can pass in any text you want. We will keep it congratulations. Next, we'll specify an optional subtitle, which is obviously displayed below the title in a smaller font and can be more descriptive for the title. By default, the alert will contain one button that dismisses it, but you can also specify your own buttons. I will create a button here using the buttons property, which takes an array. For now, we will keep it simple and just pass in a string for this array, OK. We will just have one button with the text OK on it, and it will dismiss the alert without actually doing anything. Finally, to display the alert, call the present function on the alert object. Let's test this out. As you can see, clicking on the alert button displays the alert with the said title, subtitle, and one button with the text OK on it. Clicking on the button will display the alert. You can also specify a message property, which is displayed after the subtitle in a very normal font size. It is a message that helps the user with exactly what they have to do next. Along with that, we can specify an inputs array as well. This takes an array of JSON objects where each object defines an input that is displayed on the alert. It is basically a prompt, an alert that lets users input data. For now, we will create one input. Inside the array, I will pass in a JSON object with the properties name and placeholder. The value that you pass in as the name will help you access the user's input later, and the placeholder is, well, a placeholder for the input field. Now, click on the alert button, and you will see the modified alert with an input field, where the user can enter some text and click on the OK button. You can only access the value that the user entered in the input field and an alert in the button's handler function. For each button, you can define the text and a handler. Let's modify this existing button now. We will pass in a JSON object for each button in the button array, and the first property is text. The second will be handler, which will actually be a function which receives a parameter. Let's log this parameter data to the console and see what we get. Save, and click on the alert button and enter some text in the alert input field and click OK. There you go. It shows the values that you entered as the input in the alert. All the input field's values are accessible using the handler function. You get a JSON object logged to the console. It has a property name, email, which is the name of the input field that we created, and its value is the input entered in the input field. Simple and easy. Moving on, there is one more way to create alerts that you can use if you want to have more complex inputs in your alert like radio buttons and checkboxes. Simply create an alert just as we did before, but do not pass in the JSON object. Instead, you can use various functions on the alert object. You can use the setTitle function to set a title, add input function to add one input at a time, and add button function to add one button at a time. This add input function takes in a JSON object as a parameter, as well as contains the options for the input we want to create. Simply specify a type for the input field, which we will set to radio, a label, which we will set to some text that will be displayed by the input field, and finally a value, which is a string as well. Let's replicate this and change a few things real quick. Notice how I have changed the value so that it has the values of two radio inputs as send and don't send. Very quickly, we will add a button using the add button function and specify its options for that as well. We will pass in just text and handler as usual and just log the parameter of the handler function to the console. Let's test this. Clicking on the alert button shows the alert with two radio buttons where I can select just one. If I select send me the gift and press OK, I get send logged to the console, which is the value of the selected radio button. Similarly, if I select no thank you, I get don't send, which is the value of the second radio input. You can also change the type of inputs to checkboxes and allow the users to select more than one option. Let's make some changes real quick and have some checkboxes instead of radio options. You have to change the type to checkbox. And now you can see that you can select both options. When I click OK, an array of selected options is logged to the console. You can add more buttons to offer more functionality, and the alert starts to act more like a confirmation dialog. You can perform different functions for each button because each button will have its own handler. In this case, if you click cancel, you'll get a console log that says user clicked cancel, while if you click OK, you get something else. Play around with it yourself, try different combinations, and I will see you in the next lecture. In this lecture, we will learn about using the Toast controller in Ionic. Toast controller is used to display a nice and small toast notification to the user. These notifications are generally used to display very small bits of information to the user, and typically they disappear after a few moments. We will use a new button on our page to display the toast notification. We will also bind it to a function called toast, and we will quickly create the toast function in the TypeScript file right after the alert function that we created in the last lecture. Just as we have done with the loading controller and the alert controller, we will first have to import Toast controller from the Ionic-Angular module, and then pass it into the constructor to instantiate it. Now, we are ready to use Toast controller. We will simply start by using the create function on the Toast controller object that we have, and to save a reference to it inside a local object called Toast. We will need to pass in an options JSON object to the create function. We will pass in a number of properties here. Let's start by specifying a message. Message is the primary text that is displayed in the notification. It should not be very long, as the notifications show up in a very small vertical space. Let's specify some text as the message. We can also specify a duration, which is the number of milliseconds that this toast will be shown for. Let's keep it to, say, 3 seconds, or 3,000 milliseconds. Now, let's test this out. I will click on the Toast button, and the Toast notification is displayed at the bottom of the screen. It has the text we specified as the message, and it will automatically get dismissed after the specified number of milliseconds. We can also specify if we want to have a close button on the Toast notification or not. Pass in show close button and specify a Boolean value. For now, let's keep it true. Now, let's test this out. I will click on the Toast button, and the Toast notification is displayed at the bottom of the screen. We can click on the Close button to dismiss it. We can also change the position of the notification. By default, it is always displayed at the bottom, but you can display it on the top and in the center as well. Let's try that. All you have to do is specify a position property and a value. Let's specify the value to be top. Let's try this, and the notification is shown at the top of the screen. You can also try middle. The notification is displayed in the center of the screen. The default position is bottom. You can also change the text on the close button. The default text is closed, but you can change it to whatever you want it to be. Let's change it. To do that, you can specify a property, close button text, and pass in the text as its value. I will pass in OK, and let's see it in action. You can see that the text on the button is now changed. Welcome. In this lecture, we're going to learn another of the wonderful components that Ionic has. We will learn about Action Sheet Controller. Action sheets slide up from the bottom edge of the device screen and display a set of options with the ability to confirm or cancel an action. Action sheets sometimes can be used as an alternative to menus and are displayed on top of the rest of the page, meaning you cannot interact with the rest of the page without dismissing the action sheet. Let's start. First off, I will create a new button in a new row to open the action sheet. I will change the text on the button. I will just comment out this last button to remove any distractions, and also bind it to the function called Action Sheet that we will create in just a few moments. Now head over to the home.ts file, and now we are ready to bring it into the Action Sheet controller, just as we have been doing for a while now. We have imported the Action Sheet controller from the Ionic Angular module, and pass it into the constructor. Let's call the instance name as Action Sheet Controller. Now, create that function, Action Sheet. We will use the create function to create an action sheet. We will have to pass in a JSON object to the create function as the options to configure the action sheet. Before that, let's store the reference in a variable called action. You can call it whatever you want. In the JSON object, we can specify a title and a buttons array. The title is displayed at the top of the action sheet and describes to the user what the actions shown to the user are about. Let's keep it small. Next, we will specify the buttons array. In this array, each element will be a JSON object representing a button in the action sheet. For each button, we can specify a handler function, an icon, and a role in some special cases. Let's see how it works. I will start by defining our first button with the text share via Facebook. And I will also define a handler for this button. The handler function will be the bare minimum for now, so we will also have a log message to the console. Now we'll replicate this button 2 more times to save time and just change a few things, like the text and the console log in the handler functions. The last button will act as the cancel button. It will just dismiss the action sheet. Finally, we will call the present function to show the action sheet. Let's test this out in the browser. As you can see, as I click on the action sheet button, I get an action sheet that opens up from the bottom of the page and shows all the buttons we defined. It has a share on Facebook button, a share with email button, and a cancel button. If you want to click on each one of these, you will get a corresponding console log, which means the handler is executed as soon as you click or tap on the button. You can also define a role for the cancel button. The value of role can either be destructive or cancel. We will use cancel for now. Specifying a role ensures that the cancel button will always be displayed at the bottom of the action sheet button list. It offers no other exclusive functionality. We will define icons with a corresponding console log, which means the handler is executed as soon as you click or tap on the button. You can also define a role for the cancel button. The value of role can either be destructive or cancel. We will use cancel for now. Specifying a role ensures that the cancel button will always be displayed at the bottom of the action sheet button list. It offers no other exclusive functionality. We will define icons for each of the buttons as well. The icon property takes the name of the icon as its value, which is the same name that we would use to define the ion-icon. Remember, navicons. Now that we have defined the icons for all of these, let's see how it looks. You can see that the icons show up to the left of each button. Perfect. Lastly, you might have noticed that as soon as you select a button from the action sheet, it is immediately dismissed. You can also prevent that action sheet from being dismissed. All you need to do is return false from the handler function. I will do that with the share with email button. Let's see that in action. I will open up the action sheet, and first, I will select the Facebook button, and the action sheet is dismissed. I will open it again, and this time, I will select the email button, and the action sheet does not get dismissed. The handler function still works every time we click on it. In this lecture, we covered how to use action sheets in Ionic. So far in the course, we have learned about the Ionic CLI and just used it to create the Ionic app that we have been using since the beginning. We have learned about the various components in Ionic, and we did all that in one single page. In real apps, there are multiple pages serving different purposes. In this lecture, we will learn about how to create new pages in Ionic using the Ionic CLI. You can see currently in the Pages folder that we just have one folder called Home, which contains 3 files that comprise of our home page. Now, we will create another page called Office. There are no restrictions on how you name your pages, but Ionic automatically adds the word page to the name of the class. I will start by opening a new terminal window in VS Code, and I will type the command ionic space generate space page space office, then press enter. This command generates a new folder for our page, and the name of the folder is called Office, while the name of the class in the office.ts file will be Office Page. So now we have 2 pages, a page called Home and another called Office. Let's have a look at the contents of this new folder called Office. We have an HTML file, an SCSS file, and a TS file, just as we have in the Home folder, but we also have an additional file called office.module.ts. This file is used to implement lazy loading in Ionic apps, which we won't be really covering in this course. So we will delete this file for now, and we now need to make 2 small changes. The first change would be to remove the @Ionic page decorator in the office.ts file. We will do that right quick. And .ts. This file is used to implement lazy loading in Ionic apps, which we won't be really covering in this course. So we will delete this file for now, and we now need to make 2 small changes. The first change would be to remove the @Ionic page decorator in the office.ts file. We will do that right quick. We also do not need the import anymore, so we will remove the Ionic page from the list of imports as well. The second change we will need to make inside the app.module.ts file. We will have to import the Office page class from the Office TS file, and then pass it into the declarations and the entry components array. Just we have with an import statement for the home class, we will add a similar one for the Office class. Let's do that now. Next, we will pass the Office class inside the declarations array and the entry components array. Every new page needs to be imported into the app.module.ts and passed to the declarations and entry components array. You can now save the file and close it. In this lecture, we will learn about navigating from one Ionic page to another, and you'll understand how navigation works in Ionic apps. We will create a button first that will help us navigate to the Office page that we created in the last lecture. I will uncomment this button here, and I will change the text on the button to something more relevant, like Go to the Office page. I will also modify the name of the function. Let's call the function Go to Office. Now head over to the home.ts file and create this function, Go to Office, right at the bottom. We need a navigation controller, or nav controller, in Ionic to navigate from one page to another. All pages, by default, have imported the nav controller and pass it into the constructor to instantiate it. If you look at the top of the home.ts file, you will see an import statement, importing nav controller from Ionic-Angular, and the same passed into the constructor, giving us access to an instance called nav_ctrl, which I will call navcontrol, which we can reference to do the navigation. Since we want to navigate the Office page, we will also need to import the Office page into this page. Let's do that as well from the office.ts file. Coming back to the GoToOffice function, we will also need to type in this.navcontrol.push, and we will pass in the Office page as a parameter to the push function. Ionic navigation works like a stack. The page at the top of the stack is always the page that is visible to the user. If you want to navigate to another page, you push the page into the navigation stack. If you need to go back to the previous page, you pop the topmost page from the stack. The push function takes in a reference to the page that we want to navigate to, Office page in this case. Let's see how it works. I will click on the button, and you can see that I'm taken to a new page. That is the Office page. You will see the title on the top of the page. Let's add a button to the Office page to bring us back to the home page. Kind of a back button functionality that we already have here on the top left corner. Open the office.ts and clean it up a bit. Just add a console log to the constructor that we can use later to verify the navigation. Next, open the office.html file and change the title of the page to something that looks better. I'll also change the color of the navbar, and then let's add a button quickly and wire it up with a function called goBack. Let's see how the page looks now, and for that we will have to navigate to the Office page. The color of the navbar has changed to green, and the title's also changed. And we have this button that we need to write code for. If you click on it right now, you will run into an error because obviously the function goBack has not been defined. Head back to the office.ts file. Type in this.navcontrol.pop. No arguments needed to be passed in to the pop function. The pop function pops the current page from the navigation stack and takes the user back to the previous page. Let's test this out. You can see how, by clicking on the Go Back button, that takes me back to the home page. In addition to the push and pop functions, there's another important function that beginners can use. It is the setRoot function. This function sets the specified page as the root of the navigation stack and discards all the navigation stack, which means the user cannot go back anymore. Let's see how that works. I will quickly create another button with the text reset and wire it up to another function also called reset. Inside this function, we will use the setRoot function. To use this function, we will need to pass in the home page that we will need to import as well. Now, let's test this out. I will need to head over to the Office page first, and then click on the Reset button. Clicking on the Reset button took me to the home page, and I no longer have the option to go back. All the information about the navigation stack is lost, and the navigation stack is reset. This lecture was all about navigation basics in Ionic. In the next lecture, we will learn about passing parameters from one page to another. In this lecture, we are going to learn how we can send data from one page to another. In real-world apps, we need to send information between pages to create good user experiences. We can send data to a page when we push that page on the navigation stack, and then receive that data in the page's constructor, and use it however we want. We will start by collapsing these functions to make the code look more clean and organized, and to make more room for new code. At the top, you can see that we have two variables, username and password. These variables
Oh, fuck. So close to being done.
are bound to the input fields on the page. Let's send the value of the username variable to the Office page in the GoToOffice function. To do that, all you need to do is pass in a second parameter to the push function, which should be a JSON object. So here, the JSON object will contain a key called username, and the value will be this.username. The value of the JSON object will be received by the Office page. Let's receive this object in the Office page code. To receive navigation parameters sent from other pages to a page, we need to use the navparams service provided to us by Ionic. This is often already injected into our constructors. As you can see, it already passes in a parameter to the constructor. To receive the value, we need its key, which in this case is username, this.navparams.get. The function this.navparams.get is used to receive the navigational data. The get function takes in the key as a parameter. We will pass in the username here. We will save the retrieved value to the variable called username and log it to the console for confirmation. Let's test it out. In the console, you can see that there is nothing initially, but if I click on the Go to Office button, a blank string is logged to the console because the value of username is a blank string by default. Let's go back and try again. This time, we will type in something into the input field for username. As I click on the Go to Office button, we can clearly see the value logged to the console. This proves that the data was sent from the home page and received by the Office page. You can also send JSON objects with multiple key value pairs. I can also send in the password, just as an example. I will have to retrieve it separately on the Office page and log it to the console to make sure that we received it. Let's try this out. I will fill in the input fields on the page and click on the button. Immediately, as the Office page loads up, we get the data logged to the console, which means that the Office page received it. In this lecture, we learned how navigation parameters work in Ionic. In this lecture, we will learn about using Modal Controller in Ionic. Modal Controller is used to display modals to the user. Modals can contain any content that you want to display. Generally, separate pages are created to display as modals. Modals are overlays, which means that these are displayed on top of the page that is used to launch the modal. Once the job of the modal is done, they are dismissed and the underlying page is displayed back to the user. The underlying page is never unloaded during the whole process. It is even there when the modal is displayed. Let's learn about how to create a modal in Ionic. We will start by creating a new page. This page will then be used to display as the modal. Open up a new terminal window and create a new page using the Ionic CLI. Type in Ionic space generate space page space profile. Then press enter.
Two more. We can do this. I just need some Gran Turismo music.
This command will generate a new folder for our page, the profile page. As usual, we will have a number of files for this page inside this folder. First, we will need to delete the module file, profile.module.ts, because we do not want to.
I don't know why, but I was expecting like a hard ass beat to just drop on the back of that. That's what I was saying. this is fine. This is exactly what I needed to finish this. 2 more.
Use that right now. Next, open up the profile.ts file and remove the Ionic page decorator. We do not need it for simple Ionic pages. I will also get rid of some of the comments to save some space. Optionally, you can also remove the import for the Ionic page since we do not need it anymore. Because I have created a new page in my app, I will have to import that into my app.module.ts file and also pass it in the declarations and the entry components array. Nothing new so far. All we did was create a new page for our app. Let's close the files we don't need any longer. Coming back to the home.ts file, we will import the module controller component from the Ionic-Angular module. This needs to be imported and instantiated like all the other controllers. In the home.html file, create a button that we will use to open to the home.ts file. We will import the module controller component from the...
It said module, it's modal.
Ionic-Angular module. This needs to be imported and instantiated like all the other controllers. In the home.html file, create a button that we will use to open the modal. We will bind it to a function, openModal, that we will create next. Inside this function, we will write the code to open the modal. To open the modal, you need to call the function create on the modal controller, which is an instance of the modal controller component. The create function takes in the page or component as the first parameter that will be displayed as a modal. For us, this page is the profile page that we just created. We will use that as the first parameter. Of course, we will get errors until we import the profile page as well. Finally, we will save the reference to the variable, say modal, and call the present function to launch the modal. Great, we are good to go. Let's test it out. I will click on the Open Modal button, and there we go, the modal is launched. It looks just like a page, but this is actually a modal. It is displayed on top of the homepage. Now you can press Escape on the keyboard to dismiss it. On a phone, the back button will do the job. However, a button to close the modal is a must-have. Let's create that as well. Head over to the profile.html file, because this is where the view of the modal is. Get rid of the dummy comments and create an Ionic-footer to put a button to close the modal. Create a new button inside the Ionic-footer. Bind this to a function called closeModal that we will create in the next step in the profile.ts file. Next, go to the profile.ts file and create this function called closeModal. To close a modal from within the modal, we have to import the view controller. This is, again, imported from the Ionic-Angular module. Import it and instantiate it by passing it in as a parameter to the constructor. Finally, you just need to call the function dismiss on the view controller instance variable. That's all that's required to close the modal. Let's see it in action. I'll open up the modal, just as we did before, TS file. Next, go to the profile.ts file and create this function called closeModal. To close a modal from within the modal, we have to import the view controller. This is, again, imported from the Ionic-Angular module. Import it and instantiate it by passing it in as a parameter to the constructor. Finally, you just need to call the function dismiss on the view controller instance variable. That's all that's required to close the modal. Let's see it in action. I'll open up the modal, just as we did before, and as soon as I tap on the close modal button, the modal goes away. Before we finish this lecture, we will learn about how to send parameters or data to this modal from the parent page. So head over to the home.ts file and then to the open modal function. To pass in a parameter, all you need to do is pass in a JSON object to the create function as a second parameter. As an example, here I will pass in a JSON object with the key username and the this.username as the value. On the other end, you can retrieve this JSON data inside the constructor of our modal page, that is profile.ts, using nav_params. Let's log the parameter named username to the console and see what we get when we launch the modal. Now, click on the Open Modal button. You can see that I get a blank console. That's because the value of the username variable is blank, since we did not input anything into the corresponding input field. Let's do that and try again. This time, I will enter a name in the input field and click on the Open Modal button, and bingo. We got the value logged to the console, which clearly shows that the data is being passed from the page to the modal. You can also send data back from the modal to the page when the modal is closed. All you need to do is pass the JSON object as a parameter to the dismissed function in the modal. Let's try that as well. I will pass in a JSON object with the key as status, with its value as done. To retrieve this value upon modal closing in the page, we will have to create a handler function that will be executed when the modal is closed. For this, you can use the modal reference object. You need to use the onDidDismissed function. This function is executed every time the modal is dismissed or closed. Passing in a callback to this function, the parameter to this callback will contain the data sent from the modal back to the page. Let's log it to the console as well. Now, look closely. As soon as I close the modal, I get a console log of the data we sent back from the modal to the page. In this lecture, we covered how to display modals and to send data back and forth between modals and pages.
Whew, modals, that was long. Never gonna use that shit though. Pop over, let's go.
We will learn
Last
about
one.
using the popover controller in Ionic. Popover controller is generally used to display overflow menus or context menus to the user in our app. These popovers can contain any content that you want to display, but normally they have some menu or action items to perform certain actions. Let's get started. We will start by creating an action button, generally called as the overflow action menu button, on the top header bar of our app. We will create an ion-buttons component right after the ion-title inside the ion-header. You can also see that I've also specified a directive called in inside the component and this makes sure that the buttons that we create inside this Ion-Buttons component are displayed toward the end of the navigation bar or to the right side of the title. Alternatively, you could specify Start to display these buttons to the left. I will paste in the code for an icon button here, and this button will be bound to a function called presentPopover that we will be creating in the TypeScript file next. This function takes $event as a parameter, which contains more information that we will use later. As you can see, this button displays a nice overflow menu icon on the right side of the navigation bar. Let's open the home.ts file right quick and create the presentPopover function. Right at the bottom, I'll create this function with a parameter EV. Before we do that, we need to import Popover controller from the Ionic Angular module and instantiate it by passing it into our constructor as usual. Next, we will create a new page that will contain the layout of the Popover. This works in the same way as module controller. Let's create a new page called Popover using the Ionic CLI. Once created, we will delete the module file and remove the Ionic page decorator, and then we will bring this page into the app.module.ts file. We've been doing this exercise for a while now, so I will speed through this step. Now, the page has been created and imported into our app. We will design the layout in the popover.html file. First, let's remove everything from this file and then create a list with some items. I'll paste in some code for the list. Just a simple list with a header and 4 list items, each bound to a function called close. You can, of course, design your popover however you like. Now, we are ready to write the code to launch the popover on our homepage. Come back to the home.ts file, and just where you left off, inside the presentPopover function, we will call the create function on the popover controller object, which is an instance of the popover controller component of Ionic. Simple, right? Just as we did with the module, we will need to pass in another page as the first parameter to the create function, which in this case is the popover page. First, import that, or you'll get errors. Finally, call the present function to display the popover to the user. Let's test this so far. Back in our app, we will click on the overflow button in our navigation bar, and you can see that I will get the popover in the center of the screen. It looks good and does the job, but this is not what we wanted. A popover in the center of the screen doesn't make sense. It should be aligned to the point where we clicked to launch it. This is where the EV parameter comes into the picture. Just pass in a JSON object with a key called EV and the parameter EV. As its value to the present function, and you're done. To avoid any confusion, let's change the parameter name to myEvent, and we will pass it into the JSON object. Ionic is awesome, right? Let's test this again. This time, you can see the popover opens to the right top corner where the button is located. Perfect. Now, it looks like an overflow menu. Clicking or tapping anywhere on the screen automatically dismisses the popover. You can perform any actions you want when the user clicks on any of the items in the popover. If you remember, each of these is bound to a function called close. You can bind each one to its own function. For now, let's create the close function in the popover.ts file. Just as we did in the last lecture for modules, we will import the view controller because we want to close the popover from within the popover. Finally, controller. If you perform any actions you want when the user clicks on any of the items in the popover. If you remember, each of these is bound to a function called close. You can bind each one to its own function. For now, let's create the close function in the popover.ts file. Just as we did in the last lecture for modules, we will import the view controller because we want to close the popover from within the popover. Finally, create the close button and inside it call the dismiss function on the view controller instance. Test it one last time. Now, the popover dismisses when you click on any of the menu items. In this lecture, we learned all about popovers and the corresponding popover controller in Ionic.
I'm done! Finally! I'm so tired. I'm so freaking tired. Holy Christ. Oh man, I'm gonna get fucking. Oh man. Let me end this stream. This music is so good, but I might end up getting demonetized for it. Fuck. Anyway, GG's guys. Next time I'm gonna be like developing some stuff, but I can't develop my startup stuff on here because then people will see my source code. But what I will definitely do is have like music or something, and then be coding on the side. That's what I'll probably do. But school's starting up next, so we'll see.